The morning air was crisp, the faint scent of the sea carried on the gentle breeze as Golden Heart stepped out of his hut. The village was already bustling with activity, and he could hear the distant chatter of the villagers as they went about their daily lives. Despite the warmth of the sun and the liveliness of the surroundings, his thoughts were still with Amy. His encounter with her the previous day lingered in his mind. There was something about her, an unspoken sadness that weighed on her, yet she carried it with grace. He wanted to understand her, to help, but he knew he needed to be patient. As he walked through the village, admiring the simple beauty of the island, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. It was Amy. She was walking with purpose, her eyes focused ahead, her body language still guarded, but less tense than before. Golden Heart's heart quickened at the sight of her.
"Hey, Amy,"
he called out, his voice gentle but warm. Amy turned, her expression softening slightly as she recognized him. She offered a small, hesitant smile.
Golden Heart, right?
He nodded, smiling back.
"Yeah, I was just exploring the village, trying to get to know the place a bit better."
Amy glanced around as if suddenly realizing the busyness of the day.
Well, it's a small village, but there's always something going on. I've got some errands to run, actually.
Golden Heart hesitated for a moment, then spoke up.
"Mind if I join you? I'd love to see more of the village, and it'd be nice to have someone to talk to."
Amy seemed to consider it, her eyes searching his for a moment. There was that guarded look again, but after a brief pause, she nodded.
Sure, just don't slow me down,
she added, a teasing edge to her tone. Golden Heart chuckled.
"I'll do my best to keep up."
They began walking together, the path winding through the village as they passed by the various huts and small shops. Golden Heart could feel the tension between them start to ease, though there was still an air of caution around Amy. He didn't want to push too hard, but he wanted to learn more about her, to understand the weight she carried.
"So,"
he began, breaking the silence.
"I never really got to ask you much about yourself. How long have you lived on this island?"
Amy shrugged, her eyes fixed on the path ahead.
A while. Feels like forever sometimes.
Golden Heart sensed there was more to that answer, but he didn't press.
"It seems like a nice place, though. Peaceful."
Amy let out a small, humorless laugh.
It can be, but peaceful doesn't mean easy.
He glanced over at her, noticing the way her face had tensed slightly, her eyes distant again.
"I get that,"
he said softly.
"Sometimes the hardest struggles aren't the ones you can see."
Amy looked at him for a moment, her eyes softening as she nodded.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
They walked in silence for a few more moments before Golden Heart spoke again.
"I don't want to pry, but I can tell you've been through a lot. You don't have to talk about it, but if you ever want to, I'm here."
Amy stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. Her expression was guarded, but there was something in her eyes, something vulnerable.
It's not that I don't want to talk about it.
She said quietly.
It's just hard.
Golden Heart nodded, his gaze gentle.
"I understand. Sometimes it feels easier to carry it on your own."
Amy's lips pressed together into a thin line, and she looked away, her hands clenching slightly.
Yeah, exactly.
Golden Heart felt a pang of empathy for her. He knew that feeling all too well, the burden of trying to carry the weight of the world alone. But he also knew how important it was to have someone by your side, even if you weren't ready to share everything.
"I'm not here to push you,"
he said softly.
but I can tell you're strong. And even the strongest people need someone to lean on sometimes.
Amy's eyes flicked back to him, her expression softening. She seemed to struggle with her words for a moment before finally speaking.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
They continued walking, the village fading into the background as they reached a more open part of the island, the ocean stretching out before them. The rhythmic crash of the waves filled the air, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. Amy sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon.
I used to love it here. It felt like home, but now...
Golden Heart stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue if she wanted to.
Now, it feels different.
She continued, her voice barely above a whisper.
I don't know why, but everything just feels heavier. Like I'm supposed to keep moving forward, but I don't know where I'm going anymore.
Golden Heart's heart ached for her. He wanted to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he knew that words weren't always enough.
I can't pretend to know what you're going through,
He said gently.
but I do know that you don't have to figure it all out alone.
Amy looked at him, her eyes soft but still distant.
Maybe,
She said quietly.
but I've been doing it on my own for so long, it's hard to let anyone else in.
Golden Heart nodded, understanding the hesitation in her voice.
I get that. But just so you know, I'm not going anywhere. If you ever need someone to talk to, or even just someone to walk with, I'll be here.
Amy smiled, a small but genuine one this time.
Thanks, Golden Heart. That means a lot.
They stood there for a moment longer, the sound of the waves filling the silence between them. It wasn't a complete breakthrough, but it was a step. And for Golden Heart, that was enough for now. As they turned back toward the village, Amy seemed a little lighter, the weight on her shoulders not quite as heavy. And as they walked side by side, Golden Heart couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he needed to be. And maybe, just maybe, Amy was starting to believe that too.